It's now my pleasure to welcome member Alan Konowski to the podium to introduce our main program speaker today. Alan?
Would you please warmly welcome to the podium John Gottman.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for inviting me. Can you all hear me? Is this good? A good distance from the microphone? Well, 35 years ago, I started doing some research with my best friend, Bob Levinson, who also wound up being best man at our wedding. And 35 years ago, Bob and I got together because our relationships with women weren't working very well. And so unlike the self-appointed gurus you'll see on afternoon television, we really didn't know anything about how to get along with women. And so we started this research really hoping that eventually we'd learn something that would help us in our relationships. And we really had no hypotheses. And I always think about Isaac Newton, the great physicist who once said, non fingo hypotheses. I do not frame hypotheses. So I thought that was pretty good as a start. And so Bob and I really brought to the field of the study of relationships colossal ignorance and awareness of our ignorance. So we started doing research by building a laboratory where couples could come at the end of the day and just talk about how their day went after they'd been apart for about 8 hours. And while they were talking to each other, Bob Levinson had a computer that in the 1970s was able to synchronize the video time code to the physiological data we collected. So as couples talked to each other, we were measuring simultaneously their heart rates, their blood velocity to various parts of their body, how much they were sweating from the palms of their hands, and we even put a little meter under their chairs called a jiggleometer to measure how much they jiggled around. Now, why did we do these things? We had no idea. We just thought it would be kind of fun. And we had couples talk about an area of continuing disagreement, a conflict that they had, and then a positive topic. And then we showed them their videotapes and asked them to turn a dial that told us what they were feeling, and we interviewed them about specific moments that we didn't understand at the time, asking them what they were thinking and feeling during these moments. And when I came to the University of Washington about 23 years ago, I built an apartment laboratory, which was sort of like a bed and breakfast getaway setting on the medical school campus, and it's on the Mount Lake Cut, where all these beautiful boats were going by, and we tried to make it as much as we could like a bed and breakfast getaway, except there were 3 cameras bolted to the wall, and the couples wore 2 channels, a Holter monitor measuring 2 channels of electrocardiogram, and when they urinated, we took a urine sample to measure stress hormones, and we took blood from them to look at the immune system, and people were coding their facial expressions in the control room. But aside from that, it was a very relaxed bed and breakfast kind of setting. And you know, about 20 years into this research, my friend Bob came to the University of Washington to give a talk, and a professor I was collaborating with asked the question. He was a researcher, Neil Jacobson, who did research on couples therapy. And he said, well, how can all this research help couples? And Bob said, I'm proud to say in the 20 years that John and I have been working together, we've never helped anybody. And that was true. We were really getting paid to watch couples deteriorate and making a living at it. And so we really did a series of research studies trying to look at the masters of relationships, the ones who really stayed together, didn't get divorced, and were pretty happy, more or less. And the disasters of relationships, the ones that broke apart, and the ones that stayed together and were unhappy as well. Bob and I also studied gay and lesbian committed relationships for 12 years in this 35-year period. And we really were able to study couples across the whole life course. In fact, we're just completing a study in the Bay Area now that we started 20 years ago with two groups of couples, a group of couples in their 40s and a group of couples in their 60s. And our oldest subjects are now in their late 80s. So we're just finishing this. And across the whole life course, we've looked at transitions to becoming parents, what happens when a baby arrives in the relationship, how does it affect the relationship, how do relationships affect babies, can we predict anything about child development, and we found to our great surprise that we could predict, as we followed couples over many, many years, with over 90% accuracy, what would happen to a marriage by just observing couples in our laboratory. And I think nobody was as surprised by these findings as Bob and I were, because at the time psychologists really weren't very good at predicting human behavior, individual behavior. And the people who were on our tenure and promotions committee really said to us, if you can't predict one person's behavior, how can you predict two people? You know, you'll square the amount of uncertainty. But it turns out that relationships have an enormous amount of stability. So that even from the first 3 minutes of a conflict discussion a couple is having, we can predict 96% of the time how the entire conversation will go. And from the conversation, we can predict with high accuracy whether a couple get divorced or not, how happy they'll be. And in fact, one of my graduate students, Allison Shapiro, who studied couples in the last trimester of pregnancy, was able to predict the child's temperament and the child's neurological development and reduce 50% of the uncertainty in looking at the first 3 years of the baby's life just by looking at how the parents argued in the last trimester. So we found an enormous amount of predictability. And what I'd like to do in the short time I have available is to just go through giving you an idea of what we learned and how we understand this. So I think that Bob and I were kind of like the early astronomers who looked at the heavens and tried to see patterns in the motions of stars and planets. And indeed, there were patterns that could be understood that the early astronomers looked at. And Ptolemy, of course, is known for over 1,000 years having been able to predict lunar eclipses and very accurately predict the placement of stars and the planets and the moon. But he didn't know why. He didn't understand why it worked that way, except to say that, as Aristotle said, the heavenly planets must move in the perfect circle, which turned out not to be true. It wasn't until Isaac Newton that we started really getting theory. So I want to take you through knowing our 35 years of research in which our first question was, could we find any patterns that discriminated the masters from the disasters of relationships? And second, what theory could we develop to understand those patterns? And only when we developed that theory were we able to design interventions to help people. And so these are all scientifically based interventions that my wife, Julie Gottman, Julie Schwartz Gottman, and I designed together. And she's the one who's really concerned about helping people. So that's what led to the Gottman Institute. I interviewed her about it to try to find out why that was so interesting to her. So let me tell you how we were able to discriminate the masters and the disasters of relationships. One of the basic things that when I was in graduate school, there was a book that came out called The Intimate Enemy. It was written by a guy named George Bach. And his idea for helping marriages was that the problem in marriages, he said, was that people didn't air their resentments. So we had partners face one another and take turns telling one another what they resented about each other. And he even designed these foam rubber bats that he manufactured called batakas. And they would take turns whacking each other with one of the bats. I really resent you didn't take out the garbage. Whack. And then, I really resent that we don't have sex anymore. Whack. And they go back and forth. And that was kind of the state of the art when I was in graduate school. And after hundreds of research studies, we've now learned that when you do that, people leave more resentful than when they came in. There is no catharsis effect for anger and resentment. And basically what Bob and I found was that what discriminated the disasters from the masters of relationships was that the masters were really very gentle with one another. even when they raised an issue. They raised it as if it was kind of an invisible soccer ball that they were kicking around together. They took responsibility for even a small part of the problem. Whereas the disasters really pointed their finger at their partner and were critical, and their attitude was that they were kind of diagnosing their partner's personality defects. And they wanted to be really appreciated for that by their partner. And they were hoping that their partner would respond by saying, "Thank you for pointing out all the ways in which I am failing as a human being. Can we have lunch next Tuesday so we can talk about this some more? You are such a wise person, John. Thank you so much." Unfortunately, criticism, which is stating the problem in the relationship as a defect in the partner, leads to the second predictor we have of what predicts relationships' demise, which is defensiveness. And defensiveness is any way of warding off a perceived attack. But unfortunately, the masters do the opposite. They say, "Interesting. That's an interesting point. Tell me more about what you see as our problem and how I contribute to this." The disasters become defensive and say, "It's not my fault. It's your fault." And they raise something that's a counterattack rather than responding by saying, "Interesting point. Tell me more." Or they whine. They present themselves as an innocent victim. So we saw a pattern in the way conflicts begin. And our best predictor of relationship demise was a behavior we call contempt, which is any statement you make to your partner from a superior place. And if you think you're more punctual than your partner, more intelligent, more knowledgeable about something, or a better parent, or cleaner, or tidier, then usually what you say is really speaking down and has an air of superiority. And I collect these ways of people being superior. Some people collect stamps and some people collect coins. I like to collect ways that people can be contemptuous. The most common way we found was direct insults and name calling people a jerk and an idiot, saying what they're saying is ridiculous. But one of my favorite ones is correcting somebody's grammar when they're angry with you. I think that's a really effective way of being contemptuous. So if my wife says, "I could care less about that," I would say, "Hold on there, honey. It is not I could care less. It is I couldn't care less." That's the right way to say it. Now, what was your point? So it's one of my favorite ways. So contempt is our best predictor of divorce and breakup in same-sex relationships as well, and also a predictor of how many infectious illnesses in the next 4 years the recipient of contempt will get. So it's been shown that contempt is a very wide spectrum downregulator of immune functioning. The final predictor that discriminates the masters from the disasters during conflict we call stonewalling, which is basically listener withdrawal from the conflict. And the stonewaller basically doesn't give the usual cues that a listener gives, like head nodding, eye contact, brief vocalizations, yeah, and facial movement. Yeah, that could be, yeah, sure. Oh, interesting, yeah. The stonewaller is really tuned out, like a stone wall. But when we try to predict stonewalling from our data, from our stream of interaction, we found that an elevated heart rate above the intrinsic rhythm of the heart, around 100 beats a minute, predicts stonewalling. And in heterosexual relationships, 85% of our stonewallers were guys. So stonewalling is particularly a male thing to do. Now, do lesbians stonewall? Absolutely, they do. So it's not biology. So we interviewed stonewallers about these moments in their interaction, and it turned out what they were trying to do was really calm down and not make the interaction worse. So the internal monologue of a stonewaller was something like this. Okay, just don't say anything. Let her burn herself out. How long can this last? 10 minutes to the game. She can't touch me then, That was the hope, anyway, of the stonewaller. And now, did guys who are in master relationships stonewall? They did, but they were able to self-soothe physiologically. Now, so we had these basic findings that discriminated the masters from the disasters, but they didn't help us in understanding it. So you have a diagram here in your handout that looks like a house. And if you'll get hold of that, I'll give you an idea of what our basic findings were, and then we should have time for some questions. And I'll try to stay within my time limit. So by putting together the data that we had, looking at couples over long periods of time, we discovered that one of the most important discriminators between the masters and disasters of relationships was the ability to repair interaction. That in fact, in all relationships, regrettable incidents and arguments that go out of control and hurting your partner's feelings are inevitable. And one of the contributions Bob and I wound up making was that we wound up studying really good relationships. And before this research, therapists really had to fantasize about what a good relationship would be like. Oprah Winfrey hasn't had one, for example. And, you know, Dr. Phil just got divorced. So, you know, we don't know, these guys don't really know what a good relationship is like from their own experience. And we were able to do that by doing research on good relationships. And every relationship experiences conflict and periods of alienation. But the difference between the masters and the disasters is they're able to repair. And so repair turns out to be really the sine qua non of relationships. Being able to say, I'm really sorry. You know, I blew it that time. You know, that didn't go very well. Can we talk about it? And what we thought was that maybe the way the repair was made would make an enormous difference. And for several years, we looked at the nature of repair, and we discovered that we were looking in the wrong place. It was really the recipient of repair that was the important person to look at. And what made the difference in repair working and being effective was the quality of the friendship in the relationship. Not looking at conflict, but looking at how people maintain friendship and intimacy and emotional connection. So the first three levels of the sound relationship house diagram, which is our theory of how relationships work and why our prediction was able to work, is really about friendship. And the great thing about being a researcher is you can't stay vague about this stuff. You have to measure it. So here's what we mean by friendship. And the first level of the sound relationship house is called build love maps. And we found that the masters of relationships really had a roadmap in their mind of their partner's internal psychological world. They knew a lot about their partner. And the fundamental process that allowed them to know that is asking open-ended questions. Not questions like, did you pay the plumber? You know, but questions like, how do you feel about your career right now? Or how do you feel about injustice in Africa? What's your mission in life right now? How are you thinking about yourself as a mother? And how is that changing now that our kid has left high school and left home? Those kinds of questions are the ones the masters are asking. And they're remembering the answers, which is another part of building a love map. Now, you laugh, but actually, I've had a lot of couples in my office where, you know, one of them will say, I really don't know what you find erotic. And the other partner says, I've told you many times. And I say, here's a pen and some paper. Take notes this time. Okay? Try to remember the answers. So, love maps is a very interesting thing because it builds a basic sense that your partner is really interested in you and knows something about you. And it's something a lot of people don't do, not because they're mean-spirited or have a psychopathology, but because they really don't know this information. And we teach people how to do this in the first couple of hours of our couples workshop. And we have ways of doing it that are entertaining and a lot of fun. And so building a love map is a process that anybody can do. It doesn't take a lot of skill. And yet you'll find, you know, you might want to observe this, how many times even at parties people ask questions. And you'll find that it's a very rare thing for people to do. The next level of the sound relationship house we call building the fondness and admiration system. And that was very interesting because what happened was that in the disaster relationships, people had a habit of mind where they were scanning the environment for their partner's mistakes. They were trying to understand why they were so irritated with their partner and annoyed and alienated. And so they looked at their partner to see what their partner was doing wrong so they could help their partner become a better human being and thereby be happier. Whereas in master relationships, they were looking for what was going right, and they were appreciating that. And they were building a culture of appreciation and respect and affection on a moment-to-moment basis. And changing that habit of mind from looking for what's going wrong turns out to be very critical, not only in couple relationships, but also in parent-child relationships. Very, very different when a parent is noticing what a child is doing right when the child is trying to learn something, than pointing out the mistakes the child is making. Very, very different performance patterns. So that was the fondness and admiration system. And the next system, the next level of friendship, is really what we call turning toward. And we found in the apartment lab that people were making these bids for emotional connection. They were trying to get their partner's attention. They were trying to tell a joke. They'd start off saying, okay, there's 4 lawyers in a boat. And then the camera would look at the other person, right? And some people would be maybe cleaning their glasses, and they hear this joke, and they just keep doing what they're doing. No response, right? And some people would say, yeah, okay, 4 lawyers in a boat, and we call that turning toward. And the no response we call turning away. Or sometimes people would give an irritated response like, I am trying to read, and we call that turning against. Now, it turned out when we studied 130 newlyweds, a representative sample in Seattle, and looked 6 years after the wedding, that the couples who were still together, not divorced, had turned toward one another in the apartment laboratory, turned toward bids of their partner 86% of the time. The couples who were divorced had turned toward their partner 33% of the time. And we were measuring a couple of months after the wedding. So that was an excellent predictor, this building this emotional bank account by turning toward bids. And bids are really ways in which your partner, a lot of times very subtly and non-verbally, expresses a need for affection, for conversation, for interest, for emotional support. And when people really build an awareness of that, that's the fundamental process, then they start really building this emotional bank account. So those were the elements of friendship that we could work on in our workshops, and we could train therapists to really work on in therapy, that build a positive emotional connection in the relationship that is the basis for repair during conflict, that makes conflict work, right? Be constructive rather than destructive. So that conflict really can be a way that couples get closer to one another, and they can understand each other better. Conflict is inevitable, and it's really a mechanism for learning how to love one another better, because we all make errors. We all communicate badly, and that's par for the course in every relationship. So that's what friendship was about. Now, a surprising thing was that these 3 elements of friendship, love maps, turning toward, and fondness and admiration, were also the basis for satisfying sexual relationships, romance, and passion in the relationship. In many marriages, and also in gay and lesbian relationships, once people have a committed relationship, they appear to stop courting one another, and they appear to stop having romance. Now, this dimension of romance is very interesting. At a recent workshop, one of our a woman and one of the couples in the workshop raised her hand and she said, could you please define romance? And, we opened it up to the audience and we got maybe 30 different definitions of romance. And what is romance? And I asked my daughter this question. Now, she's 18, and she gave me the best answer because I went on Google and tried to find out all these ways people defined romance, and none of them were very satisfying. But my daughter said, romance is an agreement that you make with your partner that there would be magic in your relationship. And it's a shared fantasy that eventually becomes a reality. I love that definition. So anyway, that shared fantasy that becomes a reality, the way we create magic by really cherishing our partner, is something that happens only when these first 3 levels of the sound relationship house, the components of friendship and intimacy, really are happening. And they're things you can build. They're not ethereal, they're measurable, and they're things that we can really teach therapists to build, and we can teach couples to build in our workshops. If you work on the friendship, you automatically are in the positive perspective, which is the next level of the sound relationship house. And what that means is that generally your cost-benefit analysis of your partner's character and the relationship are more positive than negative. And so when your partner says something maybe in an irritable way, you don't take it personally. Whereas the negative perspective, people really have a chip on their shoulder, and they have that chip on their shoulder because they don't feel like this person is their irritating friend. They feel like this person is their adversary. And so they're looking for negativity. They're hypervigilant for slights and put-downs. And they distort reality and even see positive things as potential put-downs. So there's some research studies that show that if you're in a negative perspective, you tend not to see 50% of the positive things that your partner is actually doing in an evening as measured by outside observers. So that's what the positive perspective is about. Now, the theory is that the positive perspective or the negative perspective is the litmus test of the quality of friendship and intimacy in the relationship. If you have a chip on your shoulder and you're hypervigilant and hypersensitive for negativity in your relationship, the chances are your friendship isn't working very well, and repair is not going to work very well. So the management of conflict, which is the next level of the sound relationship house, will not work very well. Conflicts will escalate, and that's what allows us to predict so well. So what happens here is that people are in a state of hyperarousal when they start dealing with a conflict. So during conflict, the disasters of relationships at the very outset are hearing what their partner is saying, whatever complaint that is, as a personal attack. And their heart rates are going up, they're secreting adrenaline, many physiological systems are firing, and they're becoming flooded. So that they're in a mode of not being interested in what their partner's saying, but really guarded. And we call it, what the hell is this mode, rather than what's this mode. That's what makes conflict badly from the very outset. Whereas if you're really talking about an area of conflict with your friend, even if it's a tough area to talk about, then you're more receptive and you're more in a what's this, an interested mode, and conflict goes entirely differently. Now, we also learned that some conflicts are very different from others. And the conflicts where compromise seems unthinkable are usually not about the topic that the couple is discussing, but really about the meaning of each person's position, the existential meaning. So, for example, conflicts about money that seem intractable. And a lot of couples are arguing about money now with the economic downturn starting. We know a lot about this and how unemployment and job loss and economic hardship really predicts more stress and more conflict, particularly about finances and money. Most conflicts about money are not about money, and they're not about the budget. They're not about arithmetic. They're about what money means and the history that money has meant to that person's family in the past. And we can really have people talk not so much about the issue, but about their hopes and their dreams. And once they are aware of what those dreams are, then we can resolve those conflicts usually 86% of the time in our workshops. So making life dreams come true is an essential part of these kinds of existential conflicts, but also really asking the question of what is it that you really want in life, and knowing that. One of my favorite movies is a movie called Don Juan DeMarco. And Marlon Brando and Faye Dunaway are in that movie. They're married, and Marlon Brando is getting ready to retire. He's a psychiatrist. And Johnny Depp is his patient. And Johnny Depp really loves women. He thinks he's Don Juan, but he loves femininity. And he is very poetic about it. And it affects Marlon Brando tremendously. So in one scene, he's talking to Faye Dunaway about his retirement. And he's trying to convince her that it's going to be a good deal. And she's really pretty wary about it. And at one point he says to her, "What are your dreams? What do you want? What do you hope for? What do you wish for?" And she gets real quiet and she says, "I thought you'd never ask." And that's what this level of the Sound Relationship House is about. It's really about asking those questions. And the top of it is about the way people create a sense of shared meaning and purpose. Because when people start to have a committed relationship, they are really not just having a relationship with one another that's romantic, that has conflict, but they're really building a life together, a life with meaning and purpose and mission and legacy and culture and values. And unless they have the conversations they need to have that make those meanings intentional and shared, then they go through life really not building this very important existential part of their connection together. And that is really the final part of the Sound Relationship House. And that's pretty much everything I know about relationships. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. We have time for questions?
Yes, indeed. We have time for a number of questions, so raise your hand.
One word I didn't hear from you is the word respect, but you seem to describe mutual respect in a lot of what you said.
Yeah, fondness and admiration is about affection and respect. So admiration is our term for respect. It's as important as love and affection. Absolutely.
Hi. Can you talk about the telltale signs of a relationship that will stay together but be unhappy in the relationship?
Relationships that stay together and remain unhappy are very similar to ones that break up. They're just a little bit less intense. So they're quantitatively different, but not qualitatively different. So people who stay together and are unhappy eventually lead parallel lives. And they go down this cascade of distance and isolation that we can describe very well. And eventually they're really living in parallel, but they're not very connected and very lonely.
Back here. I have two questions for you. If you had to name, I know these things all are interactive and they all work together, but if you had to name one thing that's the most important ingredient to a good relationship, what would it be? Would it be friendship, communication, et cetera? And then the second question I have is your work, in your work that you've done, have you looked at the chances of marital or relationship success being greater with two working spouses as opposed to one stay-at-home and one working spouse? And in addition to that, when children are brought into it, does that change the work or your findings?
Excuse me, I got a telephone call. My daughter. Well, those are great questions. If I was going to pick one thing, and I was asked this question by the marketing director of Random House when he was trying to decide whether to put any money in marketing my book. He said, can you tell me in just 30 seconds what I should do to make my marriage better? And I said, I think the most important thing you can do is to know and honor your wife's dreams. And he got up and left the room. And it turned out he went back home to Brooklyn on the subway. And his wife thought he'd gotten fired. And she said, what are you doing here? And did you get fired? And he said, no, I want to know what your dreams are. And this guy Ross told me this later. And he said, her answer was, I thought you'd never ask. So that would be the one thing I think, if I was going to pick one thing, is to really ask these open-ended questions that are very, very deep and I think very respectful. And two people working, these kinds of things about what can you describe about people? Do they have common interests? Can you pick any sort of descriptive demographic variables about a relationship that will allow you to predict the relationship? Are generally pretty bad, because it really all depends on how people have the two careers and what they're really saying to one another. So, for example, in studies of two-career families, what turns out to be most important is the perception of fairness. And it's not fairness, it's not being 50-50, it's the perception of fairness. So it gets back to respect, point that you made. If there's a feeling that you're in this together, that really makes a big difference. Now, the same thing is true about the effects of a baby on a relationship. Effects of a baby on a relationship, 70% of the time, are deleterious. So the majority of couples having babies in the United States are hurting their relationship. They're having less conversation, less sex, more hostility, and the hostility is transferring to the baby and affecting the baby's neurological development, cognitive and emotional development. And yet we can reverse those trends in 10 hours of a workshop that we give at Swedish Medical Center. So once you know what to do, then you can change this transition when a baby comes so that it can actually be an opportunity to get closer and build a stronger family rather than have it tear a family apart. And it's really all about dealing with conflict well, maintaining friendship and intimacy, and honoring the role of fathers. Because fathers, we now through hundreds of studies, have an enormous role to play in the development of daughters and sons. And the secret of keeping dads involved with babies is to have low conflict with mom and high intimacy with mom. So it's really something we can really change. And our effects are very large in the area of prevention rather than intervening when problems have really developed and are severe.
Doctor, in that connection, did you find or study whether folks that had masterful relationships, whether they believed their parents also had masterful relationships, and vice versa?
Yeah, a great question. Generally, there is an effect of parents staying together and being happy. Not staying together. If they're miserable, it doesn't really do anything. Just stability. Very small effect. There is an effect that people are more likely to get divorced if their parents have been divorced, but the really big effect is whether their parents have been happy with one another and have had their conflicts in private, not in front of the children. Because that raises children's blood pressure. It scares them. And so it is important. The role model that we create for our children in our own relationships. That's one thing we say to couples who are expecting a baby is the greatest gift you can give your baby is a happy relationship between the two of you. So you're not depriving your baby of anything when you go away for a bed and breakfast getaway and really have a romantic evening, an overnight. In fact, you're really helping your baby.
This is a follow-on to that one. It's fine to be, and I think important to be, repairing those relationships that need help. But in follow-on to that question, it seems like we need to have more investment in training young people into how to become good spouses.
You're absolutely right. And, we know how to do that. We have the instructional technology to make that happen. And it's in the work of a social psychologist who's an award-winning psychologist named Elliot Aronson, who has really done all this work called the Jigsaw Classroom in training school students in elementary and middle school and high school to be able to work cooperatively with one another. And that emotional intelligence can be built, and we know exactly how to do it. And Aronson's interventions have been effective on every continent on the planet, and yet hardly any schools are doing it today. So we know how to create this emotional intelligence, how to build the ability of people to really get along with other people, to deal with conflict, to maintain intimacy, but we're not doing it in schools. Instead, we're emphasizing just the rudiments and the basics.
What's the role of chemistry in your model?
What's the role of chemistry? Well, we don't really know. I mean, I think it's huge. We are animals, and liking the way your partner smells and tastes and, liking to kiss your partner and hold your partner and be close, I'm sure those are very, very basic things. And we know something about maximizing genetic diversity being much more attractive. And somehow the pheromones of somebody who's genetically different from you turns out to be very alluring. Now, it doesn't necessarily predict a good relationship, because there we're thinking with the small brain rather than big brain. But it does have an important role if you can look for these other indicators as well.
What about when one partner brings a certain amount of baggage to a relationship, like alcoholism, drug abuse, previous abuse in a relationship? how does that affect, and what is the other partner supposed to do about it?
Yeah, the more baggage. Well, I think we all bring baggage. It seems that nobody, at least, as far as I know in my experience, research and clinical experience, escapes childhood without some kind of wounds that they carry with them. And Tom Bradbury at UCLA calls these our enduring vulnerabilities. And they're evident in every conflict. So everyone has these triggers, and the more you can, it seems also that we don't ever outgrow them. They become less powerful at hijacking us in conflicts, but if they can become something that's known and shared in the relationship, then we can learn how to avoid these things that we carry with us from childhood. Now, some of them are more extreme if they're involved in acting out, if we're unaware of what sets us off and what makes us vulnerable, then we're less likely to be able to get control of them and change them. So addiction is a very good example of a situation. Alan Marlatt at the University of Washington has shown that most of what gets recovering alcoholics to go off the wagon are interpersonal conflicts, particularly with ex-partners. And so we can identify the critical incidents that lead to addictions being an ineffective way of dealing with the conflicts and the critical incidents. And if we know what they are, then we can really help people with alcoholism and addiction. So we now know how to do that, and Timothy O'Farrell and Barbara McCready have done research that shows that we can really, if we integrate the treatment of addiction with couples therapy, we can get much bigger effects. So couples therapy appears to be the most effective way to deal with that, and also with medical problems like dealing with patients who've had heart attacks and keeping them on medication. If you involve the spouse in a good way, then you get more adherence to drug regimens, and people live longer. Okay, last question.
The most important question of all, did Dr. Phil really get a divorce?
I read it in the newspaper, so I presume it's true. I don't know. It's probably not widely publicized, but you can know everything there is to know about relationships and still not be able to make yours work. That's because we always partner with people who are less mature than we are.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gottman. Your work is inspiring and fits so nicely with our theme of love this year. Thank you for coming and sharing with us ways to strengthen our relationships. Thanks again to all of today's program participants. Next week, October 28th, we'll meet just 3.5 short blocks north of here at the Westin Hotel. In our quest to highlight the wonders of the World Wide Web, we're going to learn about Buddy TV, one of the largest entertainment destination sites on the web today. And in our short segment, we'll enjoy a special vignette treat from the Intiman Theater. You might remember our friends Oli and Lena from out in Ballard. Recently, Lena thought Oli could stand to learn a little bit more about romance, so she signed them both up for one of these couples workshops. So they went, and when it was over, Lena thought it was great. In fact, Oli seemed to take quite an interest in the idea of more romance. Then on the drive home to Ballard, Lena really knew the retreat was a success when Oli put his hand on Lena's knee. Giggling, Lena said, "Oh, Oli, you can go farther than that if you want to." So Oli drove on out to Snohomish. See you next week. We're adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.